guys, welcome back to Alamat, where we translate and narrate Philippine myths, urban legends, and horror stories to share to the world. For this third episode, we will be talking about some cryptids of the Philippine mythology. I know there are a lot of monsters from the Philippines, but today we'll only talk about three. The first one for today is a monster called the Aswang. An aswang is, according to Filipino folklore, a shape-shifting cryptid. They look like humans by day and they shapeshift by night when they hunt. When they have chosen their prey, they shift into their predatory forms and they wait for the person to be alone. Then they attack. This first story is called Take Care of Your Babies by Dark Food on the No Sleep subreddit. I did not want to believe it at first, but we were always warned like it was common knowledge. My mother says if you talk about them, they will know because they can hear you even if your cities are apart. Well, I hope typing doesn't count because I'm already doing my best not to tremble while writing this. On our way to visit our grandparents in the farmlands, our mother would point out to us the houses of aswangs. Some turn into ghouls, some turn into manananggals, whichever one. They have super strength and can fly or leap high, and they like to eat babies. They can smell a fetus in the womb of a pregnant woman at least 100 meters away. It's a delicacy for them, making it difficult to resist. They will pierce into the stomach and pull the fetus out to eat. They look like normal people when they don't transform into their monstrous or aswang identity. We wouldn't have known or recognized one if our mother didn't tell us who were the known aswangs. She says if we see them, we have to greet them first. It's important that we have a strong spirit so they don't prey on us. They can tell if you're scared or weak in spirit. When we visited my grandparents and we were walking up a hill, a relative told me, "That's her." We looked at the lady and waved hi. I can't imagine how they transform into manananggals. A kid once told her classmates at school, "I saw my mother fly out of the window last night. She looked different." That kid was the daughter of that lady that we encountered. It was a talk of the town. People say her mother probably has not told her about the curse yet. It's not genetic, after all. It's a curse, stored in a rock, swallowed by the aswang, passed from generations to generations. They can't die, like actually, rot underground, unless they pass the curse to someone else. They rise from the ground as soon as the rooster crows. That is, if they end up mistakenly buried by the townspeople. They move from town to town to avoid being recognized and known as aswangs. Some people who don't know what they are think they are dead and bury them. Mother says they don't want to be monsters, but they live with the curse. In fact, they are very religious. They always attend the Mass on Sunday, always asking God for forgiveness, Mother says. They'll try to eat on animals as long as they can, until their bodies can no longer take it. And when that day comes, they'll eat any person of any age. If we hear the loud sounds of a tick-tick, they're like crickets that make tick-tick sounds. It means the aswang is close by. But as soon as the tick-tick softens its sound, the aswang is near you, possibly watching you. It's just Filipino folklore. At least I thought it was. There was a rumor that an Aswang moved into the city, my home city. They said she resides a few blocks away behind our house. And I did not want to believe it, although we did hear the tick-tick often at night. A few weeks after, my grade school teacher, with her daughter, she was around 4 to 5 years old, if I remember correctly, moved into the same neighborhood where the rumored Aswang was living. For nights, her daughter would cry, got a fever, felt nauseous, and point at the ceiling. My teacher said her daughter was pointing at nothing. She didn't see anything, but she knew there was someone else in the room. She felt it. My mother warned her about the Aswang and told her that it's probably too hungry to resist. My teacher took her daughter to different doctors and they did not know what was wrong with her. After 3 months, my teacher moved to a different island and her kid was feeling better. Not long after, her daughter experienced it again and died. My teacher mentioned that her daughter didn't look the same anymore. My mother says when they can't easily have them alone, they place a dummy body with a spell that makes you think and see it's the same person, as if your baby never left your side. We still heard the tick-tick though. I guess the Aswang visits our home here and there. I always thought our mom protected us. She was not afraid of anything. Her spirit was always strong. And we always slept together in the same room. We have 2 beds set right beside each other, so we, together with my 4 siblings and my parents, would fit in this long, wide bed. We didn't worry much about the Aswang. It was commonplace. We had nothing to attract or bother it until our housemaid got pregnant. We kept telling our mom to send her back to the farmlands until she gave birth. But my mom said, our maid had a strong spirit. She might even bicker and debate with the Aswang if it decides to violate her room. One night around 10 p.m., we couldn't sleep. My 2 brothers and I decided to play with the computers in the living room. We were scaredy cats, so we asked our eldest sister to come with us. Our youngest brother and parents were asleep in the bedroom. My sister decided to lie down on our short sofa. The back of the sofa was against the wall, close to the glass door, which was the entrance to our house. You'd see her feet reflecting on the glass door as her feet hung out from the edge of the sofa. The computers were 3 to 4 meters across the sofa. It was pitch black outside, so we could see our reflection on the glass door. My brothers and I were watching funny music videos and playing computer games. We laughed so loud like our laughs were on speakers. Then the glass door shook. No, it was being shaken, back and forth with such strong force. The whole glass door was being shaken. The shaking gets louder and louder, stronger and stronger. We thought the handle would break. I thought the glass will break anytime soon now. We were in shock and braced ourselves at our seats as we stared at the door. What have been 6 seconds felt like a minute to us, and that minute felt like forever. Then the shaking stopped, and we stared at each other with our eyes wide open and thought, did you see that? The only way to know who was outside was to peek through the glass door or open the glass door. Afraid that that thing was still out there looking straight at us, we hesitated to move for a second. Then we all ran for our lives to our parents and told them about it. Father said it could have been just our dog, excited to see my sister's feet. He just said that so we would calm down and not be afraid. I think the Aswang mistook My sister for our pregnant maid. It wanted to break our door. And no, it couldn't be the neighbor because we have tall walls and a tall gate surrounding our house. We asked our maid about it in the morning, and she said she didn't feel or hear anything that night. And after a few weeks, our pregnant maid left. The second cryptid that we will be talking about is called a Capre. A Capre is technically a tree-dwelling cryptid in Philippine mythology. They are invisible to normal people and they enjoy playing tricks and confusing wanderers who pass by their areas. Even though they are invisible, there have been reports of sightings of the Capre. They appear as a male tree giant with hair all over their bodies, and they have some sort of loincloth covering their waist down that is being held up by a magical belt that keeps them invisible. This story is an experience with a Capre by Under a Tree on the No Sleep subreddit. Among many legends in the Philippines, there's one about a tall, slender tree demon called the Capre. I learned about this one from my grandmother many years ago when I was growing up in a fairly rural area of the Philippines in a little town near Baguio City. She told me how they were these gigantic bearded men who smoke tobacco and play pranks on people. Capre also has this small white stone that could force them to fulfill any wish you desired. Being 5 years old at the time, I constantly thought about what I'd wish for if I could ever get my hands on that stone. Mostly candy or toys, or even a bigger house for my family if I was trying to be a good boy. I thought about it in school too, and that's where the story takes place. The school I went to before we moved to the big city was a little 3-room building. One room for the younger kids, one room for the older kids, and one room for the staff room. It had a small clearing out front with a fairly large balete tree in the middle. There was a dirt path on the other side of the tree, and beyond the path was a dense forest. When school let out, we'd leave the building and run out into the clearing to play for a bit before heading down the path towards our homes. It was on one of these days, during the heat of early summer, that my best friend June and I found ourselves playing underneath the tree. We had picked up some sticks and were fighting imaginary monsters with our imaginary swords. The monsters were winning at first, but June and I soon managed to turn the tables in our favor until we collapsed at the foot of the tree, exhausted. The sun was beginning to set when we noticed the smell. Tobacco smoke. We didn't notice it at first because we were so wrapped up in our war with the monsters, but we should have noticed it immediately because of how out of place it was at the school. None of our teachers smoked. The only reason I recognized it as tobacco smoke was because my uncle smoked tobacco that smelled the exact same. I looked around to see if I could find him, but the field was empty. All the other kids had already gone home, and since the teachers usually went home first, we were the only 2 souls in the area. It didn't matter that much to us at the time, so we just kind of shrugged it off and went home, since the sun was already heading closer to the horizon. Later at home that night, I remembered the description of the Capre. June wasn't at school the next day. Sometimes, kids stayed home to help their families with things, so it wasn't all that out of place. When school let out, I sat under the tree and watched some of the other kids play. June was more fun to play with than they were anyway. It was a really quiet and clear day. No clouds in the sky, No hint of wind. The only dust in the air came from the other kids, kicking it up while they chased each other around. I caught a whiff of smoke in the air and realized that it still smelled like tobacco underneath the tree. Out of curiosity, I stood up and started to walk around the tree, all the while staring up into the branches. Nothing moved, no visible sign of smoke, and nothing that looked out of place. Somewhat disappointed, I sat back down and stared absent-mindedly at the other kids and drew little stick figures in the dirt until I felt like heading home. As I stood up again to brush the back of my pants off to go home, I thought I heard the rustling of leaves above me. I quickly looked up, but there was nothing there. Just the same canopy of leaves and branches. It was getting a little late and my mom would be worried, so I just shrugged my shoulders and started down the path. About halfway to my house, I remembered there wasn't enough wind today to make the leaves rustle like that. About a week passed since June's disappearance. I asked the teacher about it, but she said she hadn't heard anything from his family. When I went by his house after school one day, the house seemed deserted. No lights on, no movement inside. He must have moved to a different city. I was heartbroken. Jun had been my best friend, and he hadn't told me that he was moving. It's a big thing for your best friend to just disappear without a word like that at such a young age. His family didn't even tell anyone that they were moving, since my teacher had apparently not heard anything about it. That was probably the oddest part of the whole thing. Most of the time, families moving up and out of our little town was a big deal, but no one seemed to have heard anything or even really noticed except for me. The more I thought about Jun's disappearance, the more convinced I was that the Capre was in the tree in front of our school. The tobacco smell was there every day since Jun and I first noticed it. I scrutinized every inch of that tree before I gave up for a bit. It wasn't until one day at my house when I heard my uncle talking about some good tobacco he'd brought home from the city that I had an idea. That night, after my family had gone to sleep, I crept quietly from my siblings and my room to the living room where my uncle kept his tobacco in a nice little box. Not wanting it to be too obvious, I emptied some of the tobacco into a small bag and put the box back where I'd found it. Then I slipped outside and headed towards the school. It was a quiet night. I had never been outside so late at night before, and everything looked so different. Trees grew taller. Shadows were more menacing. The crunch of my feet on the dirt seemed to echo for hours as I tried to quietly walk down the path. Every time I heard a sound in the forest to my left, I was convinced that it was the Capre out there following me. I had always thought of them like a sort of benevolent genie who would grant wishes. But out here, where the only light came from the moon and the stars, I began to doubt that. After walking what seemed like the longest hike I'd ever made, the schoolyard and the tree came into view. The schoolhouse itself was dark and empty. Nothing moved. I crept up to the balete tree where I had last played with June a couple of weeks ago. I could still smell the tobacco as I looked up into the branches. It smelled a little different tonight. The light from the stars above seemed to puncture through the leaves of the tree, making themselves visible as I craned my neck back to look straight up to the top of the tree. One star in particular was much brighter and redder than the others. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the bag of tobacco that I'd stolen from my uncle and gingerly put it at the base of the tree. Not sure what else to do and say, I just stared at the bag for a bit in silence. I don't know what I was expecting to happen, and right at that moment, I felt really stupid. My uncle would definitely notice that half of his tobacco was missing. I'm sure one of my older brothers was awake when I snuck out of the house, and he'd probably tell on me. They'd put two and two together and think that not only had I stolen some of my uncle's tobacco, but I was smoking it too. I'm not sure why I turned around, started to walk off then, knowing how much trouble I was likely facing tomorrow after school. I hadn't moved but 10 steps away from the tree before I froze. The leaves had rustled behind me. My heart throbbed in my ears so loudly that I'm still not sure whether I heard what followed next or not. I think I heard the sound of a plastic bag rustling. I think I heard branches creaking and leaves rustling again. But I can't be sure of any of that. What I do know is that as I looked down at my feet, unable to move, a rounded white rock about the size of a quail egg rolled up from behind me and stopped in front of my feet. The whole world seemed to go quiet as I was compelled to reach down and pick the stone up. As if my will had nothing to do with my actions anymore. I held the stone cupped in both of my hands. It weighed much more than it looked like it should. Everything around me had stopped moving, and I couldn't even hear my heart pounding in my ears anymore. There was nothing except for me and the stone I held in my hands. I can't tell you how long I stood there staring at the stone, but I remember feeling a sense of urgency return after some time. "I want June back," I whispered. All at once, everything started moving again. My heart leapt back into my ears. A sudden gust of wind nearly bowled me over, setting me back in motion. The stone fell from my hands, but I kept moving away from the tree, my feet carrying me ever swiftly down the road. I felt raindrops on my face as I ran, felt a crack of thunder ripple through my body as the sky lit up behind me. I can't say that I was very quiet when I finally made it back to my house, but it didn't matter too much. The storm covered any loud noises I made getting back into my bed. I didn't sleep that night, but I don't really think anyone else did when the storm came through. That storm was one of the biggest that I can remember, though we didn't live there very long. Luckily, there didn't seem to be any real damage to any of the houses in town, except for one. Jun's old house had been destroyed by a sudden deluge of water that came down from the hill behind it. Not much was left other than the floorboards and some parts of the fence. School wasn't cancelled that day. The weather was actually quite clear, and there weren't even any clouds left in the sky. Since there wasn't much to clean up in town, most of us kids still showed up for class. When I got to school that day, the tree was on its side, completely uprooted. The lightning from last night must have blown it clear out of the ground. The other kids were around the hole it had left, pointing and chattering amongst themselves. "That doesn't look like a root." "Some roots are white, stupid. They don't get sun to tan them brown," some of the kids said. I felt some rain fall from the sky, even though the weather was so clear. I glanced up to find the clouds, but didn't see any as I walked up slowly to the edge of the hole and looked down. I could see 3 or 4 white roots at the bottom of the hole. Confused, I looked at the bottom of the tree and could see that most of the roots were shades of brown. None of them were as ashen gray as what was in the hole. Without a word, I slid down to the bottom, my feet and hands getting caked with mud. I made my way towards one of the roots and reached down to tug at it. The root was soft as I grasped it with both hands and pulled. It was held pretty firmly in the ground by the mud, so I had to tug really hard until it came out of the ground with a satisfying sucking noise. I wasn't ready for it to come out so fast, and I fell backwards onto my rear, wincing. Then I heard a scream, It was one of the younger girls. More screams followed her as I opened my eyes to look at what I had just pulled out of the ground. It wasn't a root. It was an arm. I scooted back away from it in horror, my back against the dirt in the side of the hole. I felt something firm pushing against my back that didn't feel like mud. Slowly, I turned around and saw his face. Jun's head was in the side of the mud hole. I had uncovered it slightly when I slid down into the hole to see what was down there. I never did find out why Jun had been buried under the balete tree like that. My family moved away from that small village shortly after the incident. I tried talking about it with my family a number of times. My uncle's face would darken and he'd just ignore me. The rest of my family would distract me with polvoron, a Filipino candy that is like a bunch of sweet powder, which if you eat a lot, you really won't be able to talk much. It worked, because soon enough, I stopped asking questions and eventually moved on. The third cryptid that we are talking about today is called the Chanak. Chanaks are what some people call demon babies. What Chanaks are can vary from story to story. Some think that they are the offspring of a woman and a demon. Others think that they are the aborted fetuses that come back to life just to look for the mother to take its revenge. Most reports states that Chanaks live by the forests and they mimic the cries of normal babies to lure people into where they are. When the people are close enough, the Chanak attacks and devours the humans. This story is called The Nameless One by 7 Signs on the No Sleep subreddit. My sister used to work as a librarian for a Catholic school. She would often tell me how weird things happen in the library between 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. During this period, all students and teachers are in their classrooms. The empty library felt strange, unfamiliar, and very alien during this dead hour, according to my sister. Books fall from bookshelves, TV from the audio-video room will suddenly switch on, and photocopy machines printing out blank pages. She associated most of them to technical issues, and the books falling from improper stacking. Everything goes back to normal the minute the bell rings after 11 a.m. Students start walking the corridors again, and teachers enter the library, and so on. One day, the head librarian ordered them to take out the old textbooks and replace them with the new editions, which would take around 3 to 4 hours to do. She accepted the job knowing that she would get paid overtime. Being a librarian isn't the fanciest job, and she needed the money. She was about 3 months pregnant then. Everything went fine until 7 p.m. Everyone in the school had left, and she was halfway replacing the textbooks when she heard the TV in the AV room switch on again. She did not want to waste any time, so she immediately got up, went to the room, and switched off the TV. This time, she moved to the back of the TV to unplug it from the wall. She was going to pull the plug when she saw a scribbly red line on the floor. It started from under the plug from the TV all the way between 2 bookshelves, and finally it disappeared in front of another bookshelf. Thinking that it was one of the students vandalizing the floor with a red marker, she took the mop and a bottle of alcohol and wiped out the red line across the floor. Knowing that she already wasted more than enough time not doing what she was supposed to, she immediately went back to finish stacking the few remaining new edition textbooks. While stacking, she almost dropped one of the books on her face when she heard the TV switch on for the 3rd time. This time, she cannot deny that something is really going on. She turned around and went back to the AV room to switch the TV off. But she noticed that the red line on the floor was back. She tried to rub off the ink on the floor with the sole of her shoes. And to her surprise, it rubbed off easily. So she grabbed the mop and wiped it off again. She was walking to the TV to switch it off and unplug it when she heard a scratching sound behind her. She looked over her shoulder to find nobody. She was about to press the power button on the TV when she heard the scratching noise again. This time, she was certain she heard the grumbling sound too. She turned around and saw the most haunting thing she had ever seen in her life. Its head was too big for its body and was covered in slime. One of its eyes was shut closed, while the other is bloated out of its socket. It had two triangular holes where there should be a nose. Neither of its hands had complete fingers, but where there were fingers, the bones were exposed on the tip. It was scratching on the side of the wooden shelf with its fingers, and on its belly button hangs a bloody, rotting umbilical cord, dangling all the way to the floor. It was a fetus. It was a Chanak. It started to walk towards her, moving like a little child in fast forward motion. My sister dropped the mop and ran for the fire exit by the AV room. She ran screaming all the way to the guard on duty and abruptly called home for me to pick her up. She resigned from her job after that night. We soon learned that a couple of years ago, there used to be a bathroom in the library. It was next to the AV room, but it was closed up and blocked with a bookshelf after a high school girl aborted a fetus on her own inside the toilet. If you guys enjoyed the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. It would help me out a lot. If you have any suggestions and recommendations, write them down in the comment section below. All the sources from the stories can be found in the description box. Once again, thank you guys and see you in the next one.